Okay, so the lecture today is Parenting and Marriage, the Transition to Parenthood. So just to start you off with a quote about this transition. Suddenly you realize that if you were going to survive this thing intact, the two of you are going to have to work together. And so basically what this is saying is that a lot of parents realize that, when they first become parents, that's a very hard transition. And to actually be successful, it takes, teamwork. So today's goals, what I'll be talking about are parenting choices, marriage and the transition to parenthood, experiences as a couple, so what couples typically experience as new parents, and then I'll go through some new parent education and talk about like some workshops, teaching things that are available for new parents. So parenting choices, there are 5 basic parenting choices. Well, the first, of course, is whether or not to actually have children. And then once you've decided, if you that you want to have children, then the next question you have to ask yourself or decide is the number of children you want to have. Parents also have to decide the interval between children. So if you want your children to be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years apart, things like that. And when you're deciding the interval between children, you also have to think about things like, how old you want to be when you have children and, like what that means for their development. So if you have a child, you know, when you're 20 or 25, then you'll be 30 or 35 when that child is 10, or 40 or 45 when that child is 20. So those are things that need to be taken into consideration. Parents also have to decide about the method of guidance and discipline, so how you want to raise your children, and also the investment in the parental role. And so this is basically how salient or important that role of parent is and what you think parenting is actually going to look like for you specifically. So regarding the nature of parenting choices, so like we've talked about in previous lectures, the absence of a decision is a decision. So, for example, by not deciding on a consistent discipline style, you are essentially making that decision to have that inconsistent discipline style. So, you have to make decisions regarding how you want to raise your children, and by not making decisions or enforcing certain rules, that is a decision in and of itself. There are also some trade-offs. So all parental decisions actually involve trade-offs. And this can be committing to a parent without yelling, threatening, and using corporal punishment. That can actually be taxing for parents to use other methods of discipline for their children. Another thing is to view decisions positively. So view like bad decisions positively. So all parents are plagued with the belief that they made a bad decision rather than berate themselves or, have negative thoughts. Parents might actually emphasize the positive outcome of their difficult choices. So for individuals who choose to be parents, the transition to parenthood is a significant period of transition in their lives. The ecological perspective emphasizes the significance and potential of studying transitions, and so of which the transition to parenthood is certainly an important one for those individuals who choose to or become parents. When partners become parents, they begin to take on a whole new host of important roles. And these roles include things like being a caregiver, a provider, a teacher, and a protector for those children or a child. And so when mothers and fathers take on these new roles, there will certainly be implications for their prior relationships. And more specifically, these new parenting roles will have implications for their marriages and the functioning of that marital relationship. So if you remember that inverted J curve that we've talked about previously, talking about how marital satisfaction has this sort of dip a little bit, some researchers set out to explain this and examine, why we're actually seeing this dip in marital satisfaction. So the study I'm going to talk about today by Belsky and Cox, it's a well-designed longitudinal study, and it interviewed families before and after the birth of their first child. And this is actually one of the major studies on the transition to parenthood that's been conducted to this day. So regarding the methodology and sample, there were 140 couples recruited through a Lamaze class, which is pre-birthing breathing techniques. To be eligible for inclusion in the study, couples had to meet 3 criteria. The partners had to be married, legally married, and both spouses had to be having their first child. So if this was a second marriage, but it was still their first child, they were still eligible. But if one partner had had a child previously, they would not be. And also, the wife had to be between the ages of 18 and 35. And so when you think about sampling, if you have, for example, very young mothers or older mothers, like over 35, they may have different experiences in their transition to parenthood. So that's why restricting the age range is important in this study. So regarding data collection, couples were interviewed and videotaped and actually completed self-report data at 5 points in time. And so this is really great when you think about longitudinal research, is to have this many time points, because it really looks at how these processes and things are changing over time. So the 5 points in time that couples were interviewed at were prenatally, and this was during the last trimester of pregnancy. The second time point was 3 months after the child's birth. The third time point was 9 months after the child's birth. The fourth was 12 months after the child's birth, and the fifth was 24 months after the child's birth. So, again, when the child is 3, 9, 12, and 24 months old, the parents were interviewed. There were also lab visits, where they conducted the strange situation at 13 and 15 months. And the strange situation, again, is to look at how the child is the attachment relationship with its caregiver. And so in the self-report, and this would be things where they would fill out like a questionnaire, the parents were asked about their self-esteem, social support, work stress, marital satisfaction, depression, anxiety, personality traits, and infant temperament. In the interviews, parents were asked about their marriage and the parent-child relationship. And what was actually videotaped, so the marital interaction and parent-child interaction was videotaped, as well as a family interaction, and again, Mary Ainsworth's strange situation, which I said earlier was to observe the attachment relationship between the child and their caregiver. And so also there were observer ratings. So a trained observer, probably a graduate student like me, or potentially an undergrad, um, basically went into the home environment and observed things like infant temperament, parent-child interactions, and a marriage. So now I'm kind of going to talk about some of the experiences that were observed in this study and kind of the findings. So on average, couples do decline in marital satisfaction across the transition to parenthood. However, this study found that there were actually three different types or patterns that were evident when you look at the data more closely. So there were the three patterns were the decliners, people who didn't change, and then the improvers. So the decliners accounted for 50 to 51% of the couples in this study. And what this kind of looked like was they were seeing or reporting less love in their relationships, more ambivalence, more conflict, and less communication between the partners. In the no change group, so again, they wouldn't be showing that inverted J as much, it would be more of a flatter line. That accounted for about 30% of couples. And these couples overcame difficulties such that their marriage and marital relationship or satisfaction didn't decline, but it was not enough to actually improve the marriage. So, and then there's the improvers, and this was the least frequent group, and that accounted for about 19% of couples. And in these couples, they were reporting and experiencing more love with each other, less ambivalence, less conflict, and actually more communication. So, of course, you know, what you ideally would want to do is improve over this time period. And so, looking at some of the differences between improvers versus decliners, there are actually some demographic differences. So decliners, so the people whose marital satisfaction decreased, had more conflict and less communication over this transition, actually were less educated, had been married fewer years prior to their child being born, were younger, earned less income, so didn't make as much money. The husbands exhibited less interpersonal sensitivity. And so this could be things like, being sensitive to your wife's needs and engaging in some behaviors that would be supportive of that relationship. Lower self-esteem was also shown for husbands and sometimes wives as well. So it could be either husbands or wives or both partners were showing lower self-esteem in the decliner group. And also there were some infant characteristics too, so such as an unpredictable infant temperament, which was more prevalent in the decliners versus the improvers. But there were some positive moments that were noted. So families felt closer as a unit. Couples felt like they were more of a team. And I'll show you a couple quotes that demonstrate this on the next slide. Family traditions. So there was a sense of family identity. And they felt closer to parents. So new parents sort of acknowledge what their parents went through and develop a closer relationship. So again, when we're thinking about these positive moments, here are some quotes that kind of demonstrate what I was talking about earlier. So the first one, suddenly you realize that if you are going to survive this thing intact, the two of you are going to have to work together. And so again, that kind of demonstrates this closer as a unit team approach that was really seen as a positive thing over the transition to parenthood. And then regarding the family transition, another quote that really illustrates that point is one parent said, When I was a little girl, we used to spend every summer on the Jersey Shore. Since Jane's birth, Everett and I have spent a lot of time talking about the traditions we want to start for our family. And so, again, having these experience as a child, you kind of have to merge them in your new family because you're bringing traditions from both partners. And so that actually helps to create a sense of a family identity as you create these new family experiences that are a blend of your family of origin experiences. So I'm going to stop there for part one. In part two, we will pick up with problematic areas of the relationship. So stay tuned.